you very much. Is this working? Yes. Is this working? Yes. So I'm going to be talking about withdrawal effects from antidepressants and how to safely stop them. But what I'm saying applies to all psychiatric drugs. And I should say before I launch into a whole lot of graphs that I've already talked about, that a lot of what I've learned came from the peer support community. I guess my contribution was to put a bit of science to it, but as Cooper mentioned, a lot of people work this out themselves without the help of doctors, and I guess I'm trying to bring it a little bit into mainstream medical practice with, as I've mentioned before, middling results. So let me, I see I've got to sit here and look at this. I see I can sit down there. So what is a withdrawal syndrome? It's a set of physiological symptoms that occur on stopping or, double microphone, yeah, stopping or reducing the dose of a psychiatric drug. Because these drugs affect so many parts of the body, not just the central nervous system, but the peripheral nervous system, the guts, the hormonal system, there is a very long list of both physical and psychological symptoms that can occur when you stop the drugs, which confuses the hell out of doctors and patients. And these occur because of adaptations to the brain caused by the drug use, which take time to resolve. So Robert Whitaker already mentioned this. You know, our bodies are controlled by the principle of homeostasis. We want to stay in the middle. When it's too hot outside, we sweat. When it's too cold outside, we shiver. If we take a drug that increases serotonin, our body becomes less sensitive to it. If we take a drug that blocks dopamine, we become more sensitive to it. We like to counter whatever is happening to us. When you stop the drug, those adaptations to the drug don't just disappear in a second. They persist, sometimes for months or years. And the mismatch between what the body is used to and what the drug is giving is what causes withdrawal effects. It's crying out for what it's missing. And because it can take months or years for those adaptations to go back to normal, that's how long it can take withdrawal to resolve. And that also confuses clinicians because we've all been taught or seen from movies like Trainspotting that withdrawal takes a week or two. And they get very confused when things take months or years. But that's how long it takes for receptors or other parts of the body to adapt to the drug no longer being there. Another misconception is about addiction. People hear the word withdrawal, they think addiction. That's not the case. Addiction involving compulsion, craving, often drugs that make you euphoric, is not relevant to many psychiatric drugs. It is to some of them, but most it's not. All you need for a withdrawal effect is to use the drug repeatedly, your brain to become used to it. In pharmacology textbooks, that's called physical dependence. That word has become used interchangeably with addiction, unfortunately, which causes a lot of mischief out there, but you don't need to be addicted to have withdrawal effects. You don't need to be addicted to have withdrawal effects that are so severe you can't stop the drug. As an illustration, I'm going to imagine that most people in the audience are physically dependent on caffeine. If you stop drinking caffeine, you'd get a withdrawal syndrome, not a particularly severe one, but also I'm going to guess that nobody is stealing from the neighbours to get more caffeine or injecting it because addiction is not an issue. So why, we've talked a lot about how doctors aren't quite up to speed on this. Why is that? It's quite simple. For many years, guidelines, clinical practice, medical education has been based on short-term studies. Drug companies do studies that go for 6 to 12 weeks. After those 6 to 12 weeks, they stop the drugs, and most people have mild and brief symptoms. Some people already have quite severe symptoms after a few weeks, but mostly it's true that most people have mild and brief symptoms. And that's what's entered guidelines. Guidelines like high-quality studies. These are high-quality studies done by drug companies, and that's why for years, actually still today in America, the APA guidelines say withdrawal effects from antidepressants are mostly mild and brief because it's after short-term studies. But the longer you use a medication, the more your brain and body gets used to it, and the worse the withdrawal effects are when you stop it. More severe, more common, more long-lasting. And so now in America, there are 25 million people who've been on the drugs for years and some for decades. And so looking at short-term studies is almost irrelevant to them. The analogy I would use is if a car company crashed its car into a wall at 5 miles an hour and said it's safe on impact, that would be very misleading because most people drive their cars at 80 miles an hour on highways. And that's what's happened with the drugs. The short-term trials don't tell you what's happening to long-term people. Withdrawal effects include headache, dizziness, panic attacks, anxiety, low mood. There are also some very severe effects. that are also overlooked in most medical education. Akathisia is number one up there. Restlessness, agitation, terror. People take their lives because they have so much unpleasant, their living lives are so unpleasant, they want an out. When they turn up at emergency departments, they're often dismissed as having a mental illness. This must be mania, psychosis, agitated depression, because most clinicians are not aware of this as a withdrawal symptom. Suicidality can be connected to akathisia. We know that happens to a lot of people who were not suicidal before they started the drugs. So this is a new onset withdrawal effect. Obviously, it can be very serious. And then protracted withdrawal syndromes. You know, if withdrawal was just a week or two, it wouldn't be a big deal. It's the fact that it can last for months or years. People can't work, they lose jobs, they're debilitated, they're bedbound. That's what makes this so devastating for some people. Misdiagnosis of withdrawal effects as relapse. It's very easy to understand why this happens. When guidelines have said for many years, withdrawal effects are mild and brief, and somebody turns up in your clinic or to the emergency department and they've got severe, long-lasting symptoms, it's easy for clinicians to think this can't be withdrawal. It must be a mental illness, it must be something else, it must be psychosomatic, and they come to all sorts of misdiagnoses and many sorts of example. So if that's the problem, I want to talk a little bit about the solution, how to minimize withdrawal effects by safely stopping drugs. So a lot of what I'm saying is summarised in the Maudsley Deprescribing guidelines. It outlines how to come off these drugs safely for a lot of different drug classes. There's also, the Royal College of Psychiatrists wrote some similar guidance that I was involved in. There isn't at the moment similar guidance in America, except for there's some now guidance on benzodiazepines, which has some pros and cons to it. The basic principles are the following. For people who have used antidepressants for more than a few weeks, dependence starts to build, and it can take months or years to come off the drugs safely. You sometimes need to go down to very low doses before stopping, less than 1 milligram. You should go down in smaller and smaller size reductions, and the rate should be adjusted to the individual. And I'll make sense of where some of those ideas come from. This is a study we published a few years ago in the Lancet Psychiatry that looks at the way that drugs affect the brain. So this is an example. It's citalopram sold as Celexa in America. On the x-axis, on the y-axis is effect on the brain. I don't think there's a pointer. The main point here is the relationship between dose of a drug and its effect on the brain is not a straight line. So 20 milligrams doesn't have half the effect of 40 milligrams. In fact, there's very little difference in terms of effect on the brain. And in America, the smallest tablet for Celexa, I think, is 10 milligrams. Even a tiny dose like 2 milligrams, if you trace it up, has about half the effect of 60 milligrams, a surprisingly large effect. And the reason for this relationship is something called the law of mass action. And what it basically means is, when there's not much drug in the system, all the receptors for the drug are open for business. A bit like keys with locks, all the locks are open. And so every milligram of drug at low doses has a very large effect because every drug can find a lock to go into. A bit like the game of musical chairs, near the beginning, it's very easy to find a chair. As there's more and more drug in the system, more and more receptors are occupied, and every extra milligram of medication has less and less incremental effect, like at the end of the musical chairs game. So you get this law of diminishing returns, and this shape is called a hyperbola. And that allows us to understand what happens when most doctors tell people how to come off their medications. So a very common approach would be go down from 20 to 15 to 10 to 5 to 0, what's called linear tapering. It's very easy for a doctor to recommend half a tablet, 3/4 of a tablet, maybe a half tablet every second day. It's just very hard for patients because the first reduction from 20 to 15 causes a small change in effect on the brain on the y-axis. Next reduction a bit more. Some people already find that very unpleasant. Some people it's a bit easier. As you keep going, 10 to 5, bigger again. And going from 5 to 0 is like jumping off a cliff. It has about 20 times the effect of going from 20 to 15. And so a doctor that doesn't understand this relationship sees in front of them a person falling to pieces in the last few milligrams. They think the person needs the drug. They've relapsed. They've had a return of their condition. They must need the drug. And patients explain exactly this. They say the first few milligrams are easier to come off and the last few milligrams are hell. So what makes more sense is rather than reducing by even amounts of dose on the x-axis, I've drawn 4 horizontal lines separated at 20 percentage points on the y-axis. So you're reducing by even amounts of effect on the brain rather than even amounts of effect on dose. And that requires going down by smaller and smaller amounts, with the final dose in this example being 0.8 milligrams, much smaller than the widest available tablet, which is 10 milligrams, so that final dose reduction from 0.8 to 0 doesn't cause a larger change in effect on the brain as the previous reductions. You can think about this as, imagine this curve is like a walking path. You start off, it's a very shallow country walk, very easy. As it gets steeper and steeper, you have to go slower and slower so that you don't fall off at the end. And because that curve is called a hyperbola, this pattern of dose reductions is called hyperbolic tapering, if you've heard that piece of jargon already mentioned. And so in the book, and there are lots of other places that you can get advice on this, it goes through, but this I guess is aimed particularly at clinicians. This is aimed at GPs, pharmacists, psychiatrists. It comes from a fairly famous brand of textbooks for using psychiatric drugs in the UK that are used also in America, and it goes through how to recognise withdrawal effects, how to distinguish withdrawal effects from relapse, and it goes through every specific antidepressant, benzodiazepine, Z-drug, and gabapentinoid, how to do it slowly, how to do it quickly, how to do it intermediately, how to monitor a patient, how to tailor it to an individual, and it goes through all the different formulations of drugs to use, when to use a liquid, when to use a tablet, to make it easy for clinicians to put into practice. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about what has happened in the UK in the last few years to do with this area of work. I guess, in many ways I feel that the US is behind the UK. Maybe years, sometimes I think decades, right? Some people are saying centuries maybe. For lots of different reasons, which I won't get into, probably about the role of industry and so probably the larger role of government in the UK compared to the US. But there's been a lot of people doing a lot of work on this, and so this is not my work that I'm presenting. There's a lot of people behind this, people like Anne Guy and Luke Montagu and James Davies. I guess the major manifestation in the UK has been the formation of an all-party parliamentary group. I don't know if you have such a thing in the US, where basically people from different sides of the aisle come together over a common issue that they try to raise the profile of. And so there's been a group looking at prescribed drug dependence, now called the Beyond Pills, APPG, and that has been quite influential in pushing people in government, in the health department, to look at things and identify problems and try to come to solutions. So one of the things, I'll talk about some of the things it's achieved to give maybe potentially a roadmap for what could happen in the US. It lobbied for the Public Health England, which is the peak health body in the UK, essentially the equivalent of the CDC in America, to undertake a review into prescribed drug dependence, just what is going on here. They did a literature review, they spoke to patients, they spoke to clinicians, and they concluded this is a problem. There's more withdrawal from these drugs than we had understood. People are having trouble coming off. There's not adequate guidance. There's not adequate services. If you're dependent or addicted to heroin or alcohol or street drugs, there's a lot of services in the UK. If you can't get off a drug that a doctor prescribed you, there's almost nothing. And of course, there's many more people taking prescribed psychiatric drugs than there is using street drugs in the UK. And they called for guidelines to be updated, they called for services to be established, and they called for research to be done. And some of that has been taken forward in the last 6 years. So we have a government body in the UK called NICE, which puts out guidelines for doctors. It tells them what best practice is. And it's put out 2 guidelines on how to stop antidepressants and other psychiatric drugs. I would give it a score of 5 out of 10. It's not fantastic, but it's a lot better than what was there before. It doesn't go into very detailed hyperbolic tapering principles like I put forward, but it does it broadly. Their problem was there wasn't randomized controlled trials. They didn't want to put in extra detail, which is very unfortunate because it makes it hard to implement. But there are guidelines that say use liquids, that say go at the rate the patient wants, that says go down by smaller amounts. So there is some broad shape of what better guidance looks like. the NHS, the National Health Service, we have a unified national public health system which looks after most people differently from America. It put out essentially a guide for areas around the country to reduce inappropriate prescribing of antidepressants. It was not funded at all, but it's still a directive, and the system sort of works like this, where it puts down incentives. It asked for more services to help people safely stop these drugs. Again, not a lot of funding behind it, but still establishes a principle. And then more recently, we have been working, this is a group called the Lived Experience and Advisory Panel for Prescribed Drug Dependence, working with the public health system and a sort of a part of it that deals with the pharmacy services called the Specialist Pharmacy Service, to put out guidance for doctors and pharmacists on how to step-by-step reduce antidepressants. It's essentially turned the Maudsley Deprescribing guidelines into step-by-step guidance available for free to doctors and pharmacists, which hasn't made my publisher very happy. That's a separate issue. And it looks at it's looking at it in a systemic way. So it has guidance for people that have not yet been prescribed antidepressants. It calls for more informed consents to talk about the benefits, the risks, the alternatives, and doing nothing. It calls for a management plan to be written down. This is how long you're going to be on the drug for. We're going to know you're going to stop it when this happens. This is how we're going to stop it. We're going to check you this often. It tries to put down in writing, a plan so this doesn't become an open-ended, the rest of your life plan with no plan to stop it. For those that are already prescribed, it's information to talk about reviewing medications, when to identify a moment to stop the drugs, when someone is ready to stop, evaluating the risk of withdrawal. We know things like how long you've been on the drug for, your dose, the type of drug, your past experience can help us guess at what will happen if you try again, and then step by step how to go through withdrawal of different drugs. And then probably the toughest group of people, as I think will be well known to a lot of the audience, those already in withdrawal who are off their drugs or it's too late to reinstate. What do they need? This has been a huge blind spot. This comes up again and again. We're talking about all these kind of complex ways to reduce medications, and the system is always asking, why is it so complex? And it's because they don't understand how much damage can be done by the drugs, with these protracted withdrawal syndromes. And so sometimes, we hit walls because there's not an appreciation for the problem to then justify a slightly complex solution that I've shown you. But anyway, that's an ongoing argument. What other progress has been made in the UK? There's been a long-running social prescribing movement where now doctors' offices prescribe exercise, dietary changes, arts, community classes. It was coined, I think 25 years ago. They would try to put in the word prescribing to make it attractive to doctors. They would still feel like they're doing something, but it is trying to do a very demedicalized approach to treatment of not just psychiatric conditions, but broader conditions. There has been a bit of influence of this textbook on practice. It was endorsed by the Royal Pharmaceutical Society in the UK. It was made free to its members for a period of time. In Wales, they've made it freely available to all health workers in Wales. I hope that England will follow them. And it's used, as I mentioned, for the basis of these guidelines. We have set up a clinic in London to help people come off medications, which has generally become a protracted withdrawal clinic. So we see very unwell people there. It has issues with funding, but we're hoping that it becomes a flagship clinic that at least draws attention to the fact that these issues are happening. And so this is a slightly overwhelming slide, just to show all the different things that are happening. If I can go through it very quickly. In the middle really is the all-party parliamentary group that has tried to influence therapists. So this bottom right, this blue book is written by a therapist to encourage therapists, psychologists to talk about psychiatric drugs, both being on them and coming off them, with the argument being, as a psychologist, you won't be prescribing these drugs, you won't tell someone to stop the drugs. It doesn't mean you can't talk about these issues with people because you see them a lot, and it's trying to embolden therapists to talk about these issues. I talked about social and green prescribing up in the top right. I talked about the work with the NHS in trying to make this a more systemic approach to reducing unnecessary prescribing, open-ended prescribing, and safer stopping that's being rolled out over the next year, and then lobbying of these kind of guidance groups in the government to try to improve guidance and research. And that's my time. Thank you very much.
I'd like to use my time here today to share 5 key things I've learned over my 10 years of helping people coming off psychiatric drugs, hoping this will be helpful for someone here. And in the interest of time, I'll go straight to it. The first thing I've learned is that it's not just about the taper. And Laura, wherever you are, down there, I think that's why we connected so instantly back in 2017 when we met in Copenhagen and did our very first talk together. The fact that it's not just about coming off a drug. Coming off these drugs is a profound, or can be a profound, psychological, social, existential even process. So people are not just tapering off a drug, they're often also tapering an identity or a self-story built about being medicated and labeled. Stories like, there's something deeply wrong within me. I'm defective, crazy, broken. Or my emotions is dangerous territory. And sometimes those stories need gradual tapering too, right? We can't just replace them overnight. Our self-stories tend to resist change. Even when the new story is kinder, more hopeful, truer even. If something's been part of our inner narrative for years, decades maybe, it kind of lingers. And it absolutely will pop up again in moments of crisis or lows. Rear its ugly head up again. What if they were right about me? The shift from there's something wrong with me to I was having a normal reaction to life, to adversity, to trauma, to needs unmet, dreams shattered, goals blocked, can be a profound one and can be a part of the tapering too. And honestly, I find myself, with my clients, oftentimes I find myself kind of cleaning up after psychiatry, helping them, my clients, repair their beliefs about and in themselves and about their reactions to the world, untangling what was them and what was the drug, of course. And then comes something no one was warned about, no one warned them about, the return of the full, messy, raw range of emotion when you're coming off the drug. See, drugs are primitive treatments, most of them just numb and narrow. And that transition from having had your mind, your emotions, your body numbed to once again feeling the whole thing, even just a normal, whatever that is, emotional range. Emotions are strong forces that can be part of the taper too. Again, accessing that full range of emotions without being overwhelmed, it's no small transition. You kind of wake up to yourself, depending on, of course, what effect the drug has had on you. You can kind of wake up to yourself. That can be a mixed experience at first, depending on what you're waking up to. A successful taper, I often find myself doing kind of an emotions 101 as a therapist. Back to basics. What's anxiety? What's sadness? What's sorrow? What's shame? What's an emotion? Okay, it's something that wants to move us. Emotion, it's even in the name. It's a signal. It's information. It's a protector. It's a lot of things. So that was the first thing, that it's not only about the taper. The second thing I've learned is that sometimes it is just about the taper. Certainly, many people remain on these drugs for years and decades, not because they want or need the effect or because the underlying problem is still there, but purely and simply because withdrawal keeps them from stopping. And every time they try, following the rapid, harmful guidelines that have been poisoning our field for decades, they crash so badly, forced back onto a drug they don't like taking. These are the people who would throw away the pills tomorrow if they could, if their bodies allowed them, but it doesn't. Because, as Mark talked about, it's become dependent after years of use. It's adapted. I see people every day where the drug's only function is to suppress the withdrawal state it itself has created. Psychiatric drugs, all psychiatric drugs, can cause dependence in the sense that the absence of withdrawal literally depends, in a dictionary sense of the world, on continuous intake of the drug, whether it works or not. Which, of course, is what creates this, we could say, illusion of effect, that every time you stop too fast, it looks like you still need it back on, and the symptoms resolve pretty rapidly. And the solution, of course, to dependence is tapering, gradually lowering the dose, sometimes over years, allowing the body time to adapt. And since you covered that, Mark, I'm not going to dive too deep into that one. Let's overlap. That was planned. That was planned ahead. So many of these people, the psychological work is done. They've processed their trauma, understood their emotions, triggers, changed their lifestyle, changed their diet, changed their relationship with themselves. They're ready. For them, the only question is how to get these drugs out of their system without destabilizing it too much, finding the taper rate their body can tolerate. And yet, in that situation, our biggest obstacle is purely physical, that the standard doses, the standard tablets you could buy at the pharmacy are not designed for tapering. They're too strong. They're far too strong. And of course, this is something the layperson withdrawal community has known for decades. To come off without severe withdrawal, you have to go way lower than the lowest standard available dose. And that's when the office starts looking very funny with syringes and water and capsules and beads and stuff. Simple in theory, really. Complicated in practice, which brings me to number 3, which is that tapering is both highly predictable and unpredictable at the same time. Predictable in the sense that we know that dose reductions have to get smaller and smaller. We know the biology. And we know at some point they have to get much smaller to follow that curve all the way down to 0. And most of people will hit that one reduction that, even though it wasn't bigger than the previous ones in terms of milligram, it suddenly hits much harder because we found that bend on the curve, forcing them down to the 10, 5, 3, 1% reductions at a time, which is what makes it take so much time. And even though I see this every day for 10 years, and even though after doing the meta-analysis of the receptor occupancy studies myself, it still to this day continues to amaze me just how small reductions the body can detect and react with withdrawal in that lower dose range. But at the same time, unpredictable because we never know exactly when that reduction will be, when we're forced to go slower, let alone exactly by how much. Even with our fancy graphs which show the average occupancy rates, each nervous system appears to reveal its sensitivities in real time. And the art is, of course, to adjust according to that, titrate against the level of symptoms. And sometimes this means micro-tapering, like doing even tinier reductions more steadily, calculated with astonishing precision. And a lot of people in this room here today will know how to help people to calculate that. It can really be a true lifesaver, especially for people whose nervous system has been kindled by previous failed attempts. And so there is this annoying element of trial and error to coming off psychiatric drugs, balanced, of course, with respecting always that harm can be done if we push it too fast. So there's a limit to the experimentation. And most people, at least most of the people I talk to, are scared. There's some element of being scared. Past failed attempts have taught them to respect these drugs a lot. And the message to you, when you find your hyperbolic / microtaper rate, the individual one, things start to change, and the difference can really be like night and day. The fourth thing that I've learned is that people look for things, some people at least, to add or take. But healing often comes from what we remove. Naturally, people ask, because it's so unpleasant, with their problem-solving minds, try to help. That what can I take to speed this up? What can I do? What supplement? What protocol? In other words, if there's a quick fix for withdrawal. And beyond the basics of omega-3s and magnesium and electrolytes, I've become increasingly convinced that it's the other way around, through removing things. Inflammatory foods, blood sugar spikes, sugar maybe even completely, ultra-processed diets, pesticides, and so on. The idea being that the body wants to heal itself. And it knows how to heal itself if we let it. So our job is not to get in its way, more so than it is to actively intervene in the nervous system and speed up the process, or at least try to speed up the process, which is a different thing, right? We can't force receptors to adjust faster and what other biological mechanisms are going on. But we sure can provide the body the best possible conditions to do its thing. And that's a different thing, mainly through what we choose to put in our bodies, because it is a choice. It may have become a habit, but it is a choice. And obviously, what I've started to think about it is rebuilding receptors requires energy. That makes sense, the right kind of energy. And the brain prioritizes this weaning off process, hence the symptoms. That's why you feel so bad in the process. Mood, motivation, energy, drive, all less important when there's danger ahead, which is basically what the nervous system thinks there is when we've perturbed it with a dose reduction, thus temporarily deprioritizing these in the body's hierarchy. And this is where I believe, and I'm biased in that because I've been on it for 8 years of my own life, so I'm kind of starstruck by it, but this is where I believe ketogenic metabolic approaches hold promise. Eating high-fat, low-carb, moderate protein, and the fasting, giving the body that autophagy, removing foods. After all, the brain, so I think, is the fattiest organ in the body, so it kind of makes sense that keto can stabilize the foundation naturally much stronger than any supplement you can take or add. So let's keep it simple. The brain has a hierarchy. The more tasks you give it, the more it has to do, and the less efficient it has to be. And it's no wonder that if you hand your body a lot of glucose and insulin spikes that it has to keep fixing every day, that withdrawal takes longer if you give it another task on top of withdrawal. I don't have a big major RCT proving this, but so doesn't many of the practices mainstream psychiatry use, right? And hence the body's preferred state, which I'm no expert in explaining why, I can just feel it, ketosis, can sometimes ease withdrawal because there's simply more energy, so I believe, to fix the imbalances that we cause with every dose change. So I believe and see in my clients. The rest is up to the body, and your job is to leave the symptoms alone once you've tapered correctly, obviously, like a wound almost. And I mean that literally, and readers of my book will know what I mean with leaving something alone. I mean it literally, in the sense that our symptoms and the way we have it are under attentional control. And they tend to step into the background when we focus outwards. Sounds simple, strong psychological mechanism to master. For example, I'm fairly sure that for every one of you here, it feels a certain way to sit on the chairs right now. We also have that very characteristic sensation inside our mouths all the time. Well, those are two examples of things that I think you didn't pay attention to before this idiot up here said it. And therefore, they didn't take up a lot of space in your awareness. What changed? Attention, nothing else. And in a couple of seconds, I promise you they'll be gone again. Now, stupid example maybe, but it shows the mechanism. Something can definitely be there without being in our awareness, and that is something we can train. We decide we can, in any moment we want to, turn our attention outwards. We just have to learn how to do that when it's painful and it's pulling in our direction. But it's definitely a skill that we can learn, which is one of the, when looking for natural ways through withdrawal, that's your go-to. And there are a lot of fancy exercises to actually train that. The fifth is a bit different. Sorry. The deprescribing is dangerous work because it challenges a paradigm, if not directly, then indirectly. So deprescribing threatens identities, careers, professional self-concepts, and if there's one thing that we should fear, it's humans' professional self-concepts. Most people working in this space face pushback, ridicule, attempts at discrediting, isolation, pressure to conform. I myself have been reported to various ethics committees and patient safety boards back in Denmark for simply helping patients taper slower. Not by a client, never by a client, I've never heard that, but by, well, usually psychiatrists out there who, I believe, find our message inconvenient. And I remember actually a Zoom meeting last year with some of you here present where I told you about these attacks. And what I should do, and your response was absolutely perfect. Congratulations, and you smiled. That means you've done something right. And now they're trying to silence you because you've become a threat. And I really, really think that is a very valid, legitimate mechanism in this field. And honestly, this resistance makes sense. It does. Because if what we say about withdrawal is true, if it can mimic relapse this closely and be this severe, well, then the foundation of psychiatric drug efficacy kind of crumbles. If these silly discontinuation or relapse prevention trials turn out weren't measuring relapse at all, but withdrawal, or at least part of it withdrawal, well, then the entire evidence base changes. And we can't have that. And with that, large parts, I believe, of mainstream psychiatry's legitimacy. So we're challenging the assumptions that hold the system together, at least some of them. And I've come to believe of psychiatry as it's a fragile system, right? Has some very fragile assumptions. And systems, especially large ones, always try to rid themselves of noise. That's the nature of a system. It's what makes it a system. And I believe we are, to some degree, that noise, which is why we need to do this, stick together and have the communities, and to withstand this pressure, just as I was helped last year by many of you here. And the sixth thing, yes, there's a sixth thing on my list of 5. It sounded better with 5. Is that it's worth it, tapering, coming off, because people get themselves back. Yes, withdrawal is worse and trickier and more severe than we were told, and that kind of sounds like a negative story. But if it means that a lot of the people who thought they couldn't manage their lives without the drug actually can, I firmly believe that there's a positive story in that. It's worth it. A richer, deeper life awaits. I've never, not once, seen someone regret regaining their full range of emotions, however messy, if they're supported in navigating and understanding that landscape, not fearing it, and obviously if we taper the correct way. And all this, of course, is messed by the fact that the first emotional state you enter when you reduce the dose is not you. That's the whole point, because withdrawal can be emotional too. But after that one settles, having help in navigating that landscape. And ironically, maybe not so ironically for people in here, but I find from the bottom of the evidence hierarchy, I find that people often become less prone to relapse when they're off in the right way, because they can finally feel themselves again. Rocket science, apparently, to the field. So when that chemical veil lifts and there's support present, people recover their agency, their intuition, their boundaries, their inner compass. Thank you.